Welcome to the Digital Health Business Forum. My name is Drew Gant, and I am co-chair of Venable's Healthcare Practice Group and founder of the Digital Health Business Forum. For those of us who haven't joined us before, the purpose of the forum is to provide an interest group comprised of digital health companies as well as investors in and financiers of those companies. We meet quarterly, at least quarterly, to have webinars on topics of interest and typically cover legislative and regulatory updates. We feature a company in the spotlight, and then we have a corporate and funding update as well. I wanted to note that our next meeting will be on December 6th, and we're going to dedicate the entire meeting to discussing essentially the funding process with some guest companies that have recently gone through a raise of some kind or financing of some kind to discuss their experiences, as well as to get perspectives from the angel and VC community, as well as from banks. So put that on your calendar, and we'll send you an invite in the near future about that. I wanted to kick off a legislative update with a note that the Senate recently passed a telemedicine bill called the Creating High-Quality Results and Outcomes Necessary to Improve Chronic Care Act of 2017, or the Chronic Act as it's referred to because it doesn't roll off the tongue. And that act would expand telemedicine coverage under Medicare Advantage plans in 2020. It would give accountable care organizations more freedom to use telemedicine, and it includes some key provisions which, among other things, extended the Independence at Home demonstration project to 2 years and increased the maximum allowable number of beneficiaries in that program from 10,000 to 15,000 people. It also allowed patients' homes to be used as originating sites for telehealth visits with respect to dialysis, and eliminated the location restrictions on telestroke consultations. It's really remarkable in that for three reasons. One is that it was approved unanimously by the Senate, which seems very rare these days on anything, let alone telemedicine. The CBO said it would reduce Medicare costs, which is notable because one of the hurdles for passing telemedicine legislation has been concerns that it would increase costs dramatically. And then lastly, it would streamline care coordination and improve disease management, chronic disease management, without adding to the deficit. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention before I turn it over to Michelle Jackson. Michelle is a partner of mine in our FDA practice group in Washington, D.C., and among other things, provides advice to medical device and digital health companies on FDA and FTC-related issues. Michelle?
Thank you, Drew. So today I'm going to kick off the section on the regulatory updates. I'll start here with a little bit of levity. If you can see the slide, it's just a joke. And for those of you who can't quite read it, it says it's a pacemaker for your heart, plus you can download apps for your liver, kidneys, lungs, and pancreas. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Yep, nope, that's the right one. Thanks. So at the end of July, FDA announced a digital health innovation action plan that I'm going to discuss today. And the first question is why? Why is FDA kicking off this initiative? One of the main reasons why is that in December of 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which amended the definition of medical device, to exclude certain software functions. For example, things like software that is going to just maintain or encourage a healthy lifestyle. If you think, for example, of maybe the Fitbit, or software that is administering support services at a healthcare facility, things like electronic patient records, All of these things have been now excluded from the definition of a device under the jurisdiction of FDA under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Subsequently, we are seeing a shift in a number of FDA policies and procedures, which I'll get into in a minute, as a result of this definitional change. But we've also recently seen the new FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, make statements about how the agency really needs to make sure its approach to innovative products is fostering innovation and not impeding it. And that's really important for medical device, as many people with medical device companies know, the FDA's regulatory structure is tedious, particularly with regard to changes to devices. So what we've seen in the recent past is an FDA regulatory structure that really requires FDA reapproval or reclearance for any changes to a device that could affect safety or effectiveness. And it can take a really long time to get FDA clearance or approval for these changes. When you contrast that with the digital health and the software industry, where changes are being made continually and frequently, we've got very fast turnaround times. This has been a really big source of frustration between industry and FDA, with just sort of FDA's regulatory structure not really contemplating, excuse me, the types of changes that software industry is able to make very easily. Next slide, please. So what is FDA's action plan? It is three-pronged. The first is to, of course, incorporate this definitional change from the 21st Century Cures Act into FDA's procedures and guidelines. So, for example, it will be issuing guidance to better comply with this new definition, and then subsequently also revise regulations to either remove regulations that for products that are no longer devices, or to otherwise revise them in a way that's appropriate with the new definition. The second prong of this action plan is to launch a pre-certification program. It's a new pilot program that I'll get into in just a minute for software as medical devices. And lastly, the third prong is FDA is really trying to build its bench strength internally, both building up a team internally of employees or officials that are really understand software and have the technological expertise that perhaps was not there at the agency previously. And they've also started a new program called the Entrepreneurs in Residence Program, which I will get into a little bit as well. Next slide. So what is the timing and the implementation of this plan? So with regard to the definitional change for device, FDA has put forth these timelines for revising its guidance and its rules. This year, we're expecting to see a number of changes. We're expecting the agency to publish a couple of draft guidance documents. First, just generally describing the effect of this definitional change in the 21st Century Cures Act on the agency's digital health policies. And secondly, a draft guidance that describes the design considerations for pre-market submissions such as 510Ks or PMAs or de novo submissions, and to provide recommendations for interoperable medical devices. FDA is also planning to finalize a guidance on deciding when to submit a 510K for a software change, so we're looking forward to that as well. They plan to, in 2017, withdraw regulations for products that would no longer be considered devices. And then lastly, to finalize the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, approach to clinically evaluating software as a medical device. Then in 2018, FDA has indicated that they will be publishing a draft clinical decision support software guidance, and also providing draft guidance on FDA review of products that could have both a device and non-device software functions, so sort of multifunctionality products. Next slide. So as to the second prong, the pre-certification program for companies, FDA began seeking or did seek voluntary participation in this program on August 1st. There is no official end to this enrollment, but there is a limit of 9 companies that may be enrolled. So in that regard, the time is ticking. FDA really does want to conclude this review quickly. They told companies do not expect a multi-year commitment. So I will get into a little bit more on this pre-certification program, but if you're interested, now would be the time to reach out to FDA. And with regard to the third prong, FDA trying to build up its infrastructure and get more technological expertise in the software area in-house. There was recently an application period for its entrepreneurs in residence. It just closed last week on September 29th, so we should hopefully be hearing more about that shortly. Next slide. So going a little bit closer into pre-certification. Next slide. So what does this look like? Well, so as I mentioned, the FDA is limiting this program to 9 companies. It's a voluntary program. And FDA is really going to be focusing on the company as opposed to the product, which is a very different way for FDA to look at medical devices generally. They've always focused on particular devices, clearing particular devices. So this is a real shift in the agency's thinking toward more of a company-oriented focus as opposed to a product-oriented focus. Really, the goal is to identify certain companies that, according to FDA, have this culture of quality and organizational excellence, as FDA puts it, to really try to figure out if there's ways that the agency could either sort of reduce the need for device approval or clearance, or reduce review times for faster marketing applications, and to really make the agency more agile and to be able to review these in a faster manner. The agency is really looking for companies who are wanting to do the right thing, are able to do the right thing, and have this inherent quality built into their system, such that the agency can rely on their internal procedures and have less review time according to the for the particular software product. Next slide. Again, it's limited to 9 companies. If you're interested, you can submit a statement of interest to FDA, and FDA really views this as a collaborative experience with these companies. Some of the requirements is that the company has to be developing or planning to develop a software product that meets this definition of a device. FDA is going to be collecting real-world post-market performance data. So you have to, again, it's going to be collaborative with the agency. The company can expect site visits from FDA. So FDA may be, coming to your site for visits. And the company needs to be available for real-time consultations with the agency. So all of these are things to consider when considering whether you may participate in this pilot program. Next slide. And the next slide is just another, in case you can't read it, it says doctor and physician are outdated terms. I'm your biological tech support specialist. So another bit of levity. And I will now turn it over to Shannon Jaworski, or back to Drew to then turn over to Shannon. Thank you.
Sure. Let me introduce Shannon, who's a U.S. and English law qualified partner in Venable's privacy and data security practice. She counsels clients on a broad range of U.S. and European data privacy and security issues, including the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which she's speaking on today, cross-border data transfers, data breaches, and global privacy compliance. She's a partner of mine in the San Francisco office. Shannon?
Great. Thanks so much, Drew. So I'm gonna talk today about the General Data Protection Regulation. This is the biggest change to European data protection legislation in 20 years. The new law is a regulation, so it has direct effect in all of the European member states and the EFTA states, which are Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So whereas previously you had a patchwork of 31 different national laws applicable to personal data, in Europe you will now have one law across Europe. The new law applies to businesses in Europe, but it also applies to businesses that are located outside of Europe that offer goods or services to individuals in Europe or monitor the behavior of individuals in Europe. And if you remember little else from my discussion today, remember that the GDPR may apply to a US-based business if you're processing the data of European individuals. And remember that the fines are very significant. So under previous legislation, the Data Protection Directive, at least in the UK, fines never exceeded £500,000. Under the GDPR, fines can be up to 4% of annual worldwide turnover, which is revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. And the fines are not assessed at the subsidiary or the company level, they're assessed at the group level. So I think that's a really important thing to take away when you're sort of socializing the GDPR in your business and how important it is. It's important to highlight how significant these fines are, and the potential exposure is really vast here. So I'm going to walk through a few things that are changed under the GDPR. Personal data, the definition is expanded and relevant to digital health businesses. It now explicitly refers to genetic and biometric data as falling within the category of sensitive personal data. Before you process personal data of European individuals, you have to have a lawful basis for processing. And one of the lawful bases for processing personal information is the consent from the individual. And this is a really critical feature of the new law, is that consent now has to be specific, freely given, unambiguous, and informed. It's similar to the old law, but the concept of implied consent has been entirely removed. So you have to make sure that you're getting express consent from the individual to the processing of their personal data. And the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK regulatory body for data protection in the UK, issued guidance on consent and indicated that it has to be unbundled from other consent for other processing. So you can't have one tick box that expresses consent of the individual to various kinds of processing. It has to be set out in separate tick boxes. So this is a really important difference from the old law. I think one concept under the GDPR that bears mentioning is whether an organization is a controller or a processor. This concept doesn't really exist in U.S. privacy law. And a data controller is an entity that determines the means and purposes for which data is processed, while a data processor acts solely on the instructions of the data controller. And the reason this distinction is important is that there are different obligations placed on processors and controllers under the GDPR. So before setting forth and complying with all features of the legislation, you have to figure out which terms apply based on your status as a controller or as a processor. The data subjects, so individuals, have expanded rights under the GDPR. So there's a whole section on things that rights that data subjects have with respect to their data. So they have to be able to access their data. They can ask for the processing to be restricted. They can ask for it to be deleted. They can ask for it to be corrected. And these rights have to be enshrined in notices that are provided to individuals. So maybe in a privacy policy that's consumer-facing, you need to indicate what the data subject's rights are and how they can exercise them. So who they're going to contact in order to ensure that their data is corrected or erased or the processing is restricted. Another new concept under the GDPR is data breach notification. There was quite limited obligations with respect to data breach notification under the old law. Under the GDPR, certain data breaches have to be notified to the supervisory authority within 72 hours. And so incident response policies will have to be updated to reflect these changes. Another new concept under the GDPR is anonymization versus pseudonymization of data. So data that's been truly anonymized, so it can no longer be linked to an individual, is not considered personal data, and it falls outside of the remit of the regulation. Data that's been pseudonymized, so hashed and salted, and I know that in the U.S. hashed and salted data may be considered anonymized, and I think it's worth pointing out that pseudonymized data in Europe will still include hashed and salted data. And pseudonymized data, it's helpful to transform or to pseudonymize data because it limits your obligations under the GDPR. If there's been a data breach and it relates to pseudonymized data, you may not have to notify the supervisory authority of the breach. So I think that's an important distinction to remember. Another new concept under the GDPR is data protection officers. So certain organizations may need to appoint a data protection officer. So any organization that conducts large-scale processing of special categories of data, which might include digital health businesses, may need to appoint a data protection officer. The data protection officer has an obligation to report to the highest level of management, and there haven't been explicit instructions or specification as to what this reporting obligation means. I think the latest interpretations are that there has to be at least an annual report provided to the board from the data protection officer. So this is an important new feature of the GDPR. And another thing that bears mentioning, it's not new under the GDPR, but cross-border data transfer, there's been a lot of talk about the privacy shield, and people sort of conflate GDPR with the privacy shield. The privacy shield is just one means by which to legitimize the transfer of data outside of Europe. So in order to transfer any data outside of Europe, you have to have a lawful means of transfer in place. One of the means by which to transfer data to the U.S. is the privacy shield. You can also use the model contract clauses, which are a set of contractual clauses prescribed by the European Commission. That's one of the most common ways in which people transfer data outside of Europe is using the model contract clauses. Binding corporate rules, this is a set of internal rules that have been approved by a supervisory authority, and it legitimizes the transfer of data, personal data between companies in a group. It's helpful if there's a large group of companies. It's not very helpful with respect to transfer of data to third parties. You can also still use consent to transfer the consent of the individual to transfer data outside of Europe, and you can also transfer data to countries which have been provided with an adequacy decision. And this includes Guernsey, Jersey, the Isle of Man, Israel, Ecuador, Canada, and Switzerland. And just a note on Brexit, my understanding is that the UK is currently aiming towards trying to get an adequacy decision so that they will fall in the same bucket of those countries that are deemed to provide an adequate level of protection to personal data. So I think one of the key questions that companies have is, where do we start with this? And the first thing that people typically start with is a data protection gap assessment, which compares a company's existing practices against the core requirements of the GDPR. Companies also typically start with a data map, which is a sort of audit of all the data held by the organization, where it's held, what systems it touches, and where it's transferred within the organization and outside the organization to third parties. So to bring it back around, I think the two key questions to ask here for digital health businesses: one, is your business caught because you're processing the data of individuals in Europe? And two, if that's true, then you need to know that there's significant exposure here as a result of the very significant fines that can be imposed by the supervisory authorities. So that is a crash course on the GDPR and its impact on digital health businesses.
Thank you, Shannon. That's very instructive. Appreciate it. Next, I want to introduce Brent Vaughn, who's CEO and co-founder of Cognoa. Cognoa is our company in the spotlight today and is a behavioral health company using machine learning to build digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics to better support healthy child development and revolutionize the treatment of children with developmental delays. Brent has spent over 20 years working in product and commercialization of innovative healthcare companies, including diagnostics, medical devices, and therapeutics. Prior to Cognoa, Brent was co-founder and COO of WellnessFX, a regulatory-compliant direct-to-consumer diagnostics and telemedicine platform. Brent?
Hi, Drew. Thanks a lot. So I thought I'd spend a little time explaining what we're doing over at Cognoa. We've been working with Drew here as our with privacy and HIPAA since actually pre-Venable times, going back since the formation of the company and how we interact with our users. So I thought I'd start a little bit by explaining a little bit of the unmet need, the problem that we built Cognoa to solve. As Drew mentioned, really the focus of how the way we describe what we do, digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics. And I kind of joke when we did our raise and I was out raising last year, I would sit down with a number of potential investors and I would talk about doing digital diagnostics and integrated digital therapeutics in behavioral health and how that, I believed, enabled us pretty uniquely to build an extensible platform for digital precision medicine in behavioral health. I'm not sure that many VCs understood anything of what I just said. It was hard. And certainly my friends in big healthcare looked at me and said, that sounds, I have no idea what any of that means. And so that was certainly a bit of a challenge. And for those of us who are kind of on the bleeding edge of the intersection of technology and healthcare, always kind of a challenge. But the world has changed a lot, right? We saw, I think most people in this call are probably aware of the announcement just a couple of weeks ago of Paratherapeutics for the first software only as a medical device for a therapeutic intervention, doing it in the area of chronic substance abuse, which you could say is part of the greater world of behavioral health for sure. Certainly companies out there like Amada, who's here in the city, just a few blocks away, in fact, who's done some very interesting things in weight loss as tied into metabolic syndrome and prediabetes and diabetes prevention, using their interventions served up in their mobile app as a digital therapeutic intervention. So if you look at those, I think that there's more and more. There's certainly on the diagnostic side, if you look at the intersection of machine learning and AI with FDA cleared devices. Look at what AliveCore, once again here in San Francisco, has done. Arterisys is doing some very interesting stuff down in our neck of the woods in Palo Alto, applying machine learning in the cardiovascular space to come up with AI-based diagnostic and interventions. So that's really what we look at. Next slide, please. So this is the problem that we really set out to address from the beginning. And my background is in therapeutics and device. And if you think about therapeutics, and oncology is a great example, but it follows for cardiovascular disease and a lot of the other spaces. Everybody starts with kind of their initial label claim, right? And sometimes it's fairly narrow. I think a couple of us on the call might be old enough to remember that, when the statins first came out, it was familial hypercholesterolemia, right? It wasn't for every adult walking around with slightly high LDL. And so this idea of finding a narrow claim that you can start with and then expand has worked well in device and therapeutics. And this is really where we started. If you look at the graph on the right, you see something that you've all heard about in the news, the alarming increase in the incidence and prevalence of autism in the United States, which is mirrored around the world over the last few decades. It is now 1 in 68, but if you look to the left, you see it's really kind of the tip of the iceberg. Yes, 1 in 68 children are now diagnosed in the U.S. with autism. ADHD is about 1 in 9, but if you look at the greater bucket of developmental delay, it's now 1 in 6. And so this is a really large problem that we decided we could really attack by going after a better way to diagnose the kids with autism, and then using our learnings there to expand horizontally across the broader spectrum of child behavior development. Next slide. So here's the problem if we focus on autism, but you can see it also is reflective of what happens with ADHD and other delays. In the world of autism, the average age of first concern on the part of a parent in the United States is 18 months. It's been pretty stable. The CDC, that's something they track for us. And yet the average age of diagnosis, despite all of the increased awareness and resources poured into this space over the last couple of decades, it's pretty stubborn at about 4.2 years. That in itself is a problem. When you think about it, there are parents that are spending the better part of 3 years wandering from specialist to specialist, from physician and therapist to therapist, trying to figure out what the diagnosis is for their kids, let alone the path towards treatment that then follows behind it. But if you look at the bottom part of the graph, that green area, all the published data for the last 2 decades has shown the number one thing we can do to improve children on spectrum and children with developmental delays as the larger group is to provide behavioral interventions in this critical development window of 2 to 4 years of age. And so what you can see here is that, for the world of autism, but ADHD and the others fall in line, the time that is spent waiting in line is not just lost time for treatment. The prime window for therapeutic intervention has passed. And parents literally spend 3 years waiting in line. They get to the front of the line and they're told, listen, we can do a lot for your kid, but the window to help them the most passed while you were in line. Next slide. So really, we're about this, right? The original goal is how can we change the average age of diagnosis for autism to less than 24 months of age so that every child has the ability to benefit from early intervention? There's a very simple and what seemed like a fairly lofty goal when we started. We now feel quite confident that we can affect this, and we feel that we can extend this to ADHD and other areas. Next slide. So some of the benefits that's not obvious to folks that don't work in this business every day like we do. Obviously, peace of mind for every parent. 50% of the kids that get referred into secondary or tertiary care centers in children's hospitals for an autism diagnosis, the parents get told their child does not have autism. Many times I've talked to developmental pediatricians who say they see kids that have been waiting in line for 18 months. They finally get in and are told the child doesn't have autism, the child has speech delay. Had you only enrolled them in the speech clinic 18 months ago, they would be resolved by now. Right? And these are all, any of us that have kids or nephews and nieces we're close to, we understand missing a year when you are 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, it's so hard to get back as the kids are all progressing through school. So this is something that all parents can benefit from. But one of the things a lot of people don't understand, when children get early intervention between 24 and 48 months, 25% of those kids progress to the point where they lose the autism diagnosis. They progress to the point where they no longer are diagnosed with autism. They have the ability to then mainstream and move forward into schools. Even for the kids that aren't cured, as it were, over 75% of these children who get early intervention are able to move to mainstream schools in early elementary school and then have a mainstream school experience going through middle school and into high school. And so it's not just a matter of treating these kids sooner so that the parents have decreased stress for that first 2 years. It changes the lifelong trajectory of these kids. And that was really why we started out to focus on this area. Next slide. So the way we do it, we realized that if we could interact directly with parents, we could gather information around the child's behavior and the child's development. We could use machine learning, which was first developed by our scientific founder, Dr. Dennis Wall, while he was out at Harvard Medical School. And he showed a proof of concept of being able to use machine learning-based algorithms to effectively diagnose or predict the diagnosis of children with autism and severe developmental delay. We have since taken that and built it into a daily use mobile app where parents can come on and provide us information about their child. We continue to iterate the software and the algorithms. We are now on our 3rd generation algorithms. And with each generation, the dynamicity of the app as well as the sensitivity and specificity of the diagnostic output increases dramatically. And so parents come in, they provide some simple information. We have support structures we've been able to layer in, which are really the basis of digital therapeutics. They are parent-mediated behavioral interventions that are matched to the child based upon the in-depth diagnosis that we were able to provide. And so that's why we look at this as a precision medicine platform for behavioral health. Next. Next slide. There we go. Thanks. And part of it is, if you're in software we talk a lot about product market fit. We tend to be more agile development than the waterfall development you see in medical device. And so when we started the company, we focused on this quite highly. We set up a direct-to-consumer site for a free beta. Our free beta ended up having about over 300,000 families. So we are one of the largest screeners of child behavior development over the last 2 years on the planet. But we showed that we were able to attract a large number of parents in the 18 to 36-month cohort, the exact area that right now the current system is unable to attract and diagnose. Next. And so for commercialization, people always kind of want to know how you're going to make money with this. Our initial commercialization focuses on the employer enterprise. We all know that more and more the the cost as well as the work around providing benefits, healthcare benefits in the United States is shifting to the employer group. Parents who have adolescent dependents are about 1/3 of a large employer's total beneficiary population. That continues to grow. Next slide. And the data is quite strong for the ROI side of the argument. And the ROI is interesting here. When we look at the employers, it's not just the factor that you have a 13-to-1 in terms of the dollars spent in this space. The other is when we engage with third-party payers, you look at the very short life that they have to look at their ROI under versus how long before someone switches off of their plan to a Kaiser or a Blue. The average for Fortune 1000 employers, especially the ones that we target, they're looking at more of a 5 to 7 year life, which is how long they expect these employees to work there. And their switching costs are quite high, whereas the switching costs, obviously, for a third-party payer, it doesn't really cost United anything when that person leaves and goes to Blue or goes to a Kaiser. And so we found that this marketplace is much more receptive to our ROI argument. Next. Our FDA strategy is software as a medical device. On the left, you see some excerpts from the FDA guidance, and certainly highlighted in red is something that we talked about with the FDA when we were out there for our pre-submittal as well as our 513G submittal. The intended use of our mobile app is for the primary diagnosis in a primary care setting, and so that helps us have our software be determined as a medical device, and ultimately that's the path that we think is most likely that we're going to go down. Some of the points that we discussed with the FDA in our meeting, they brought together a number of people into the room who were quite engaged, and it's a very productive conversation. We talked about the fact that our data is now, even though we have looked at pre-existing tools to help and gold standards for diagnosis, the fact that our data is collected outside of a clinical setting without the clinical supervision and mediation that's been used historically dramatically changes the paradigm for how we're generating a diagnosis. The fact that our AI system ends up being quite complex, we gave them an idea of how complex by the number and type of decision trees and how our algorithms work, but the fact that it is now a device much like the way a lab works, where a physician orders the test, gets back a result, but does not really have the ability to lift up the hood and tweak how that result was generated. They either have to accept the result or not, much in the same way they would a strep test or many of the other standard labs that I've looked at historically. Next. And so this is why we do it, right? Here's some of the numbers based on the 300,000 parents that we've looked at. For every 1,000 parents that go through Cognoa, we find that we're going to find about 30 parents that have concerns and elevated risk for delay. We're going to find about 30 kids that have high risk for autism, and we can then facilitate them to an earlier definitive diagnosis in time for them to be able to actually benefit from early intervention. And we show a picture here of Ava. Ava here is actually one of the kids we helped, right? Next. Ava was a child, much like a lot of the kids we know, up until 18 months, progressing along just fine. And then her mother noticed that she started using fewer, not more words. She didn't want to be hugged and held as much. She started pulling back from her parents slightly. When we met Eva's mother, she had been told by one of the clinicians that it looked like an autism diagnosis, and she was looking for a confirmation and a more rapid path to intervention. We were able to help. Ava was able to be diagnosed before her 2nd birthday. She was able to be put into an early intervention program. And these are the types of things that we hear from Ava's mothers now. She is now mainstream. She's now going to school. Before kindergarten, she went off to summer camp, day camp, which her mother thought she would never be able to do before. In all likelihood, Ava will lose the diagnosis of autism. By the time she is in middle school, she will probably not be that kid. She will be a kid that may still have a bit of an IEP program. She may be working on a number of things, but she will most likely no longer be on the autism spectrum. And that's why we do what we do. Next slide. So here's the last slide, and I know that as we were pulling together, I've talked to Drew and some of the others here at Venable about some of our history. So we've raised $20 million to date. We've done it with one investor, which is kind of unique, Morningside Partners out in Newton and Cambridge. Our Series A was $5 million with a $4 million follow-on, which was what we used to originally set up the company and spin the technology and license the technology out of Harvard and establish the company. We went out at this time last year, and we were looking to raise a round while we were finishing up our our second multi-center clinical study. As part of raising that round, once we got the data in, we had an offer from our existing investor to take the whole round and actually give us more money than we were originally looking for. We were raising a $7 to $8 million round, and we got an offer to do $11 million round to allow us to expand the scope of our clinical program from our inside investor. So we decided to go down that path. Happy to talk about it a little more if people have questions, but for us, in weighing the pros and cons of inside versus some of the outside investors that we were looking at, we saw a chance to have a consistent vision on our board. We certainly have learned a lot of things since we've taken an algorithm spun out of Harvard and turned it into a platform that can be used by millions of parents and can be submitted to the FDA as a medical device. And that's not been a completely linear journey for sure. It certainly allowed us to leverage our Series A successes. We have a board that is very appreciative of what we've been able to figure out, and it's kind of nice to be able to continue to leverage that going forward versus starting from scratch with a new board member. And we really looked long and hard about the critical time that would have been spent in Q4 and Q1 last year going out and driving a raise process for a fairly small company. We're less than 25 employees, versus taking that money and using that time to really execute and build value. Going forward in the first half of 2018, we look to be raising our Series B. The highlights that we expect in our roadshow are to be in the process of becoming the first FDA-cleared device that is able to provide a primary diagnosis of autism in a primary care setting. It's never been done before. In fact, there are no FDA-cleared devices as a diagnostic device for autism at all. Also, we will already have in hand proof of concept to extend that label claim to other diagnoses in the DSM-5, things like ADHD. And we've been working over the last year and a half to continually improve and roll out our integrated digital therapeutics. And so by the time we go out next year and talk about integrated digital diagnostics and therapeutics for behavioral health, we'll be able to show people what that really means. And I think that the level of understanding, certainly we hope, will be much higher than when we first tried to do it last year. There you go. If there's any questions, happy to do my best.
Thanks, Brent. That was very exciting and excellent snapshot. We are going to have time for questions at the end. There's an opportunity to submit questions online if you'd like to, and we can address them at the end of the session. Next, I want to introduce my last two panelists, my partners, Alexi Cowett, who's a corporate finance and M&A partner in our DC office and head of the firm's growth company practice, and Jim Nelson, corporate and technology transactions partner and head of the firm's San Francisco office. Alexi?
I think I'll probably kick it off, Drew. This is Jim. And
Okay.
One of the things in picking up actually where Brent left off was we're going to talk about, as we can see on the first slides, I guess what we'll describe as a seemingly fairly robust market. But from a consideration, we know that you ended up going back to the original investors, but your view of the funding marketplace at this point and, as someone who's been out recently looking.
Yeah, and I think that every story is individual, right? So mine might not be reflective of everyone else's. I mean, certainly things that I saw, easy is probably sounds like a pejorative word, but frankly, raising a Series A, raising a seed, raising $2.5 to $5 million to go develop proof of concept, I think it's just easy, right? There's a lot of that out there. If you have a good idea and you've got half of a smart team, I think that you can find term sheets to do that. Raising going later in the alphabet, being down in the CD space, if you have $5 to $10 million worth of EBITDA and you can show double-digit year-over-year growth or quarter-over-quarter growth, probably better, and you have a well-understood revenue model, whether it be SaaS or whatever, I think that's actually not that certainly looks better too, right? There's not a lot of people in that. Trying to raise the B, right? Trying to say, listen, we've established proof of concept and we want to dig in deeper and we don't yet have that EBITDA graph that you'd like. That's certainly the hard spot.
Right.
And if anything, I think the ease of the early stage has made it harder, right? There's more people that are trying to get across that valley of death, which would be more the Series B. And so finding people that understand your vertical, right? Taking money from the right people is much more important than how much money you take.
Yeah. Interesting, and I think maybe related to that is this notion that you've emphasized in yours about the follow-on. You obviously had a great start in the first place and had that sense, presumably, when you got your initial A round.
Right. Yeah, I think our investor. I've seen some large venture firms out here that list themselves as co-founders of innovative companies, right? Morningside didn't do that, but they very much were. They saw the vision from the very beginning, and as we've navigated the course corrections along the way, they've been part of those discussions. Yeah. I've been lucky enough to have had nearly unanimous decision making at a board level, and that was something that we were reticent to give up because we're not quite sure what twists and turns are going to. We know the goal for the regulatory and the go-to-market, but we don't know exactly how that path is going to be for us to get there. Much like the discussion earlier about the pre-certification process, we looked at that and we kind of decided the process might be better than the process that you don't know. Right. But so I think that was certainly valuable, and then also just timing. When our clinical data came out, we were in discussions with a couple of venture firms, but when you're a CEO and if your largest investor looks at you and says, "This is great, why don't we just give you the money?" It's hard not to say no. Right,
exactly. Time is limited. You got to spend it appropriately. So, Alexa, you want to kick off any other follow-up and into the slides?
Sure. Brent, just a follow-up question on that. Morningside, obviously, they stepped up. When you originally took them on as an investor, was your thinking that they'd be in a position to lead or heavily participate in another round? That's especially for companies that are going to be needing to raise quite a large amount of money, a relatively quick cycle. Being distracted to go out back to market for more money. Having that capacity is sometimes very important. Was that part of your consideration early on?
No, not. I wish I could say it was that prescient, but I was not. They shared the initial vision with us, and it was only. And frankly, I've had the conversations you got with drinks after the board meeting, and which is really the most informative part of the day, right? Where they've looked at me and said, "Brent, when we first got into this, we thought it was $5 million, and we'd see if we had a product in front of people that was going to hunt or not, right? The idea that they would be $20 million in 4 years down the path, that was not anywhere within the scope of what they thought were likely outcomes. And so, like I said, I wish I was that clever, but I wasn't. But certainly the track record of execution and us pioneering the space made it something that when I was going out last year, I knew that it was a very real possibility that I was going to be looking at lead investors, and there was an equal chance that Morningside could be my lead going forward. But that was something that developed over time.
Brent, this is Drew. I just wanted to interrupt for 1 second because you've changed your FDA strategy dramatically to avoiding it and kind of being more of a decision support tool to being an approved device. Did that have any impact on how your investors viewed this and sort of whether did it scare them at all, or what was their response to that change in approach?
Their response was good, but that dramatically changed the way I looked at potential investors, right? My comment earlier about it's about who you take money from. I'm on the management side, right? I'm not on the investor side, so I'm not a huge fan of trying to take less money, right? I know a lot of companies that have run out of money. I don't know if anybody's run out of stock. But for me, our ability to pivot and say, listen, instead of avoiding FDA regulation and HIPAA compliance, we are going to embrace it because from a market standpoint, we understand that is the best differentiator that we can develop to allow us to really support our monetization strategy. And we can invest once in clearing the FDA hurdle, or we can go out as a non-regulated device that is poorly differentiated from every other healthcare light tool and fight that battle on a marketing level day after day after day. You can almost look at that as a discounted cash flow model and decide where you want to spend your money. The fact that I had a savvy healthcare investor behind me who was not scared of regulatory risk and regulatory overhang. As they said, geez, Brent, the FDA has the rule book. They print it, right? They give it to you. And so the fact that they would embrace that was great. And I know some of the other investors who I'd looked at since the company's formation, they were very much excited about the digital health side, but they really meant healthcare light. I had multiple investors say, we will not invest in a company that has regulatory overhang. And that just tells me someone's not serious about being in the healthcare business. So for us, I would say that those pivots helped us think about who are the people that we want to take money from.
Right, I think that's an important point because a lot of investors are attracted to digital health because it doesn't have such a long-term regulatory hurdle. So I was just kind of interested in your response to that.
Yeah, and like I say, again, I think the commentary you made about sort of the right investor is such an important factor that not as many companies as you'd think take into account, especially if you're in a regulated space or one that has regulatory overhang, or where sometimes the exits are longer. Having patient investors that have a lot of experience in the marketplace and can not only give you good direction, but potentially give you good introductions for new investors and can be a driver for growth. I think that's a really important consideration, especially since there's so much money in the space. It's almost frothy, and the slides show that if you're going to be looking to raise a lot of capital, it's very important early on to think about who your investor mix is going to be. So that takes us to the next slide. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. If I was going to add one comment on that, and I have a lot of friends that are on the investor and on the VC side, and some of them really get it. One of the investors that I just loved and I still wanted on my board, because every time I walked out of the meeting with them, I walked out with like a page of things that I'd learned. And they just looked at me early on and they said, Brent, if you go down the consumer pay path, we could possibly get behind that. We're excited about that. We understand and we are willing to invest in market execution risk and customer acquisition risk. If you end up deciding the best way for you to change the world with your product is to be an FDA-regulated device, we can barely spell FDA over here. We don't know. No one on the firm knows anything about that, and we will cheer you from the sidelines, but we don't want to be on your board because we won't be able to help you. And we will all walk into our partner meeting and realize we invested in the wrong company. And so ultimately, I'm not able to take their money and have them on the board, which saddens me because I really like them. I think they're wicked smart. But they were very upfront about the companies they could help and whether or not it was going to be a good match. And not all of the investors were that forthcoming or that clear about what their investment thesis was, but that was really helpful for me.
Yeah, last takeaway on that is that sometimes people focus on diligence on the investors are doing diligence on the company. It should also be the company's doing diligence on the investor and understanding how supportive an investor is, et cetera. But I think your story is a great story, and well, just going quickly through the slides. I know we want to reserve some time for questions. The marketplace is still very frothy, very hot, a lot of deal activity. It's been a consistent pattern for several years and across different sectors. And Jim could speak to a couple of the sectors. I mean, there are some very, very large transactions in these sectors that so sometimes these numbers on the dollar side are warped by the large transactions, but there's still lots of smaller transactions, and so there's a lot of deal activity.
Right, and the next slide actually shows categories. These are information sources from Rock Health, which generally tracks, and I think the back and forth earlier actually tells the tale of the segmentation. People have been talking about healthcare investment, digital health for years now. The lines are getting clearer on regulated, unregulated, and as you just heard, using the regulated umbrella actually as a positive and a differentiator to try and establish market presence as opposed to being strictly in the consumer space. So I think the important thing to highlight here are all of the sectors are going quite well. The general categories are really, are you selling to consumers versus businesses? And then there are broad regulated, unregulated. And then I think the additional piece, unregulated, regulated in an FDA concept, as you heard from Michelle, which I think seeing where the FDA is moving on that adds some better clarity and better lines to declare where you're going to be. And then how many of these really wrap around data, one way or the other. It is true, and I see it in my practice all the time, whether people really realize the value of the data, they know something's there, and there's a lot of conversation going on about data capture and monetization. With that, of course, comes regulatory compliance obligations that are becoming more sophisticated all the time. I think, as Alexei said, some of these numbers are a little bit skewed because they are statistics can skew things, but as the general trend lines, the case is it's clearly continuing on an upward trend. I will say, and I think it goes a bit to Brant's comment too, there are a lot of investors who have drifted into the digital space, digital health space, from other areas of expertise that really are all but the lower right quadrant on digital therapies. And so they're leveraging technologies and kind of staying more separate from the regulated areas as compared to the ones that are really much more in the traditional health, therapeutic health space where the FDA is focused and most concerned. Lastly, I would emphasize too, even on the categorization, so much is wrapped around the consumer, completely different business model, obviously, and sales cycle and monetization as compared to getting into sales to institutional providers, where much longer sales cycle, much larger deals, and presumably those that are going into that space have a history or experience of trying to knock on those doors as opposed to creating a consumer app that may have some digital health features or a pure digital health app, but they're leveraging through more of a consumer sales model. Next slide.
The M&A activity is still quite robust. We haven't seen the end of this year. It perhaps is on track to be as good as last year. But in the health space, especially on the more regulatory side, regulated company side, sometimes the exits are a little bit slower, which goes back to, do you have the right investor mix? And you're also tending, and as the next slide will show, which is the IPO slide, the IPO market has been, there hasn't been that much activity in the IPO markets, and we'll see how much activity there'll be on the digital health side of the market. You just constantly are reading about these enormous financing rounds as companies stay private for much longer, are able to raise enormous sums of capital from the venture community, from private equity, from sovereign funds, and other investors, and then in some ways, and I think sometimes purposely, are trying to avoid the public markets because with the public markets comes a completely different investor mix, different pressures, regulatory considerations, and if you can stay private longer, sometimes your success can be enhanced, and then you often will see instead of a public offering, an actual acquisition just in advance of a public offering. So I think the story is for some of these large unicorns, they may continue to raise large sums of money, and as we'll see how much activity there is at the end of this year and then going into next year, because that will be indicative, I think, of perhaps what will happen for some of the smaller companies. But tapping the public markets is definitely not as common these days as capital continues to flow into private companies.
And I think that is, we didn't really hit it as an overall headline, but obviously in the macroeconomic environment, there's a lot of there's a lot of money in funds. We still have whether it's post 08 or we just have a new normal, so to speak, the amount of private funds available seeking returns are substantial, which is part of what's enabling this ability to get the growth capital through means other than accessing or tapping the public markets. Ultimately, it gets into situations where people ultimately would like to get liquid, at least in part, but the pure capital need is in many cases getting satisfied through private equity and VC and sovereign wealth, as Alexa is speaking to. So with that, I think that's our funding update. And Drew, we'd pass it back to you.
Thanks, gentlemen. That was very helpful. One of the things I just wanted to kind of note and tee up was that some of these companies that are making great strides in digital health look like hardly healthcare companies. I think Lyft was mentioned among the Rock Health data, and that's because they're providing non-emergency medical transport with some recent big contracts, and Peloton, which makes exercise equipment and video interactive exercise equipment. Obviously, these companies have enormous opportunity to collect health-related information, and that brings them into this sphere. But it's kind of interesting to watch the growth of digital health and what types of companies are making big strides in the space and being included in the space. Just kicking off the questions, Michelle, are you still on the line?
Yes, I'm on still.
Just wanted to ask a question for you. You mentioned some draft guidance that's going to be issued. Is there an opportunity to folks to provide input on that, and how would they go about doing that?
Yes, once FDA issues the draft or even final guidance, there is an opportunity for folks to provide comments on the draft guidance or the final guidance even, although the final guidance will have likely less impact. But FDA will issue a Federal Register notice at the time that it issues the guidance, instructing you how to submit comments. It's generally done electronically is the easiest way, so you can type the comments and just submit it electronically, and FDA will provide the deadline for comments, although it will review them even if you submit them past the deadline, although it's better to get them in ahead of time. But certainly there will be an opportunity to submit comments to the agency.
Okay. And is that something you help folks with?
Yes, absolutely, all the time.
Okay. Okay, great. We don't seem to have any comments from the audience, but again, if you would like to submit a question after the fact, please feel free to email it to me and I can get it to the right person, or email it directly to anybody on this last slide, and they can respond. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and we look forward to seeing you in December on the 6th, and we'll follow up in an email with the slides from this presentation to everyone who participated today and joined in. We'll email you copies of the slides so you have those for your benefit. Thanks very much.